Ash Ketchum's time as the anime mascot is coming to a close after 25 years at the forefront of Pokemon. And what better time to take a deep look into some of Ash Ketchum's best moments as we look into Ash Ketchum's top 10 moments from the anime. Let's start off with a bang and talk about Ash's amazing win over Lieutenant Surge's Raichu. Ash faced numerous challenges as an early Pokemon trainer and struggled to defeat most trainers he came up against. However, the first loss that really hit him hard was his loss to Lieutenant Surge and his Raichu. Ash and Pikachu really tried to defeat Raichu, but unfortunately came short of this. Following the defeat, Ash considered evolving Pikachu. However, he decided he would overcome Lieutenant Surge's Raichu without evolving his best friend, and he would come back to defeat Lieutenant Surge. Pikachu has a lot of plot armor, but what about a Pokemon that has a similar amount? Ash's Infernape was found by Ash after being abandoned by his Sinnoh rival Paul. Paul abandoned Chimchar, believing it to be a weak and pathetic Pokemon. Ash took Chimchar under his wing and trained him relentlessly, and then when Ash came up against Paul in the quarterfinals of the Sinnoh League, his Chimchar was ready and a fully powered Infernape. This battle is honestly one of the best battles they ever did in the series, and most of the battles against Paul were always really close and down to the wire. In the end, Infernape overpowers Paul's Electivire in a Super Saiyan-esque battle to absolutely obliterate it. From one fire type to another, let's talk about Ash's iconic Charizard and some of the problems he had with this Pokemon. Ash saved a Charmander on a rainy route early in the Pokemon series, but Charizard grew too quickly and then stopped listening to Ash's commands as he did not respect Ash in the slightest. However, Charizard is defeated and turned into a block of ice, so Ash spends all night tending to Charizard, trying to help him like he did when Charizard was just a small baby Charmander. And this would be the catalyst that would restore Charizard to respect in Ash. Ash had gone 7 regions without winning an actual regional championship. Yeah, okay, he was victorious in the Orange Islands, but that was just a stall tactic to wait for Gold and Silver's anime release. Ash finally won his first championship in the Sun and Moon anime at the Manalo conference with a truly powerful team. People my age grew up watching Ash lose time and time again, never being able to take on the role of champion. However, after 7 generations, it was so refreshing for Ash to successfully win a championship and become the Alola champion. Now, we have spoken about some of Ash's iconic achievements, but let's talk about some of the sacrifices he has made to give his Pokemon the best life possible. The most gut-wrenching episode of the Pokemon anime is called Bye Bye Butterfree, where Ash has to say goodbye to the first Pokemon he ever caught besides Pikachu. Ash releases Butterfree to give the Pokemon the happiest life it can with fellow Butterfrees. Honestly, if you haven't seen this episode, it is very sad. Ash has gone toe-to-toe with some powerful trainers in his time on the show. But what about some powerful Pokemon he has had to battle? In Journeys, Ash goes toe-to-toe with a lot of legendary beasts. However, this is not what we are referring to. The Pokemon movies are not canon with the show. However, one of Ash's truly best moments is when he sacrifices himself in the face of Mewtwo to protect others. Ash is not just a Pokemon trainer, he is truly a hero. Nearly in our top 3, but before we get to that, I want to show you guys another Pokemon that Ash really showed off to the max. Ash Greninja. Ash struggled in Generation 6's final battle against Elaine, and obviously Elaine would come back to win. However, Ash's fight against Elaine will go down as one of the best final battles Ash ever had in the history of the anime. Ash's Greninja goes head-to-head against Elaine's Mega Charizard X, and boy does it put a shift in. The fight unfortunately goes in Elaine's favour, it still makes for such an immense battle and such an engaging fight to watch. Number 3 on our list has to go to Ash's battle against Tobias in the Lily of the Valley conference. Ash had a pretty good run up to this point in the Lily of the Valley conference. However, Ash's luck was running out in this Sinnoh championship, as another trainer was blowing his way through the championship with only one Pokemon. That trainer is Tobias, a mystical trainer with an iconic Darkrai. Ash struggled immensely throughout this battle, losing most of his team to this Darkrai, until out came Ash's Sceptile. Ash's Sceptile went toe-to-toe with Darkrai and eventually was able to defeat it. Yeah, okay, Ash only defeated one of Tobias's Pokemon, but the fight between Sceptile and Darkrai is so good. Now let's talk about Ash's final big fight against Leon. Leon and Ash's fight really shows how much further Ash has come as a trainer from his first fight in the Kanto region. Ash has proven time and time again that his Pokemon are expertly trained to take on any challenge that comes their way, and his Galar team shows this even more. Consisting of Gengar, Sirfetch'd, Dracovish, Dragonite, Lucario, and Pikachu, this is Ash's best team yet, utilizing Mega Evolution, Gigantamaxing, and Z-moves. It really feels like one massive callback to Ash's time in the anime, and it's such an amazing fight to end Ash's journey on, and to put him in the elite trainers who have won the World Coronation series. However, Ash's best ever achievement comes from the first ever episode of the Pokemon anime, when Ash chose to put himself in harm's way to protect his best friend Pikachu from a flock of Spearow. Ash and Pikachu's relationship at this point was very rocky. Neither side could decide whether they liked the other or not, but Ash putting himself in harm's way really just cemented the amazing bond these two would have, and this would continue on even 25 years later. Ash's story may be over, but the memories we all have of Ash's time will never fade away. But for now, let's let our champion rest.
Do you know who I am? Ash from the town of Pallet. I'm destined to be the world's #1 Pokemon master.
Pokemon has become a main staple in the collectible industry, with different products selling for thousands of dollars. But what are some of the Pokemon products that are worth a lot of money that you may even have in your attic? And to start this list, we're going to talk about the black and white era Pokemon cards. These cards most people would not think anything of and would just be locked in a binder in their attic. However, if you look a little bit closer, you will see that these cards can go for a very pretty penny. Much like the next product on our list, which is the old Pokemon games. These Pokemon games are still very sought after, with copies of Ruby, Sapphire, and Emerald selling nowadays for anywhere up to $110, making these old games worth a surprising amount of money. And speaking of old games, Pokemon spin-off games are even more collectible than the mainline games, due to them having considerably less amount produced. This means iconic games like Pokemon Colosseum and Pokemon Stadium are very valuable. But that's it for the games. What about the consoles? Well, next up we have the limited edition Pokemon consoles, such as the Pokemon X and Y 3DS, which nowadays will sell for around $1,000, which is extravagant. But even consoles such as the iconic Pikachu Game Boy are also incredibly valuable. Speaking of Pikachu, in at number 16 we have the vintage plushies of Pikachu from the late 90s, which can nowadays sell for northwards of $350, meaning this random plushie you could still have in your attic could be worth a very pretty penny. And that leads into the next product, which are the Pokemon coins. These coins are used for battle in the TCG, but I bet you did not know that these coins can actually be graded by PSA, and then the value of them ramps up massively, with some of these even selling for $400. Next up we have the vintage Pokemon cards. Now, it would not be a list about expensive products without mentioning the vintage Pokemon cards. People who were collecting Pokemon cards in the 90s may have no idea how much their collection is now worth, so definitely check out your collection after you have watched this video. In at number 13 you have the Pokemon toys. Pokemon has had a long history with toy production, and some of these toys have become considerably rarer and therefore collectible, such as the marble Pokemon toys featuring Pokemon like Blastoise, Charizard, and more. While we're on the topic of toys, it's definitely worth checking if you have the Pokemon Center XY collectible toy set, since this set has gone down as one of the most iconic toy lines Pokemon ever created for its exceptional design and quality. And from toys to clothing, Pokemon has had numerous clothing lines throughout the years and has collaborated with countless brands to produce their clothing, but none are quite as bizarre as this Marill outfit, which could be in your attic as a childhood cosplay. And what better to go with a Pokemon outfit than your very own wearable Pokedex, as this is what you could get during the black and white era of Pokemon. This came with gloves, a Pikachu, and of course the Generation 5 Pokedex. Speaking of Pokedexes, you could also have the interactive Pokedex from X and Y. This Pokedex would work the exact same way as the Pokedex from X and Y, with an interactive touchscreen, a database of Pokemon from the game, and even allowing you to catch Pokemon yourself. Speaking of catching Pokemon yourself, the Pokewalkers would let you walk with Pokemon while away from your Nintendo DS. You'll be able to catch other Pokemon and take your buddy along with you using these devices from Heart Gold and Soul Silver. Since these are only for the one game, they have become surprisingly rare, and nowadays will sell for $100 plus, which is a relief to me as I own 3 of them. In at number 7, we have the bizarre and limited world of Pokemon board games. Believe it or not, countless Pokemon board games have been developed throughout the decades, and none have become more sought after than the Pokemon Master Trainer board game from the late 90s. This could be in a random board game box somewhere in your attic, so make sure you check. Now, we've spoken about all these things you may find in your attic, but what would they be stored in? Well, containers. And a lot of tins and containers have become quite rare and sought after, including certain tins from the TCG and of course official Pokemon kitchenware. These are the types of products that no one would think of keeping, and that is why they have become so rare. When you think of the types of products people throw away and never properly keep, you would be thinking of paper products, or products that should not be valuable. Well, how about a Pokemon boarding pass for an airline? Well, that is what ANA did back in the 90s, when they partnered with Pokemon before it became so big, and that's what makes these boarding passes very, very rare. Heading into the top 4, we will start by mentioning the vintage collection of Pokemon toys you can find out there. Before Pokemon took all their production in-house, there was a line of toys produced by Tommy Toys, and these products have become some of the most sought after vintage toys out there, often fetching prices well above $100. Now, let's head into the top 3 with a bang, and let's talk about some of the rarest Pokemon jewelry. A lot of people get this jewelry and let it fester at the bottom of an old jewelry box, but some of these jewelry pieces are worth a lot of money nowadays, and should definitely be rooted up. In our penultimate position, we would be remiss to not talk about the Shadowless Pokemon cards, a considerably rarer version of the base set Pokemon cards that very few people can say they have. These Pokemon cards have become incredibly sought after and could be sat in a binder in your attic. And finally, we have the rarest Pokemon product in the world, the 1997 Pokemon official vending machines. Created by Bandai, these vending machines would give out cards to people who use them, and nowadays these will sell for $30,000 or more. Thank you for watching. Pokemon has had some pretty weird products created throughout history. Recently we talked about rare Pokemon products on the channel, but today we are going to talk about the 20 weirdest Pokemon products ever made. Starting with official Pokemon cologne. Yes, this is actually a thing made by Pokemon, where you had the chance to smell like coughing and muck. Well, not really, but it was intended to help you smell like Pikachu with a citrus aroma. These were produced in 2003 and discontinued very quickly. Apparently smelling like an electric rat is not marketable. But you know what is marketable? Plushies. And what's better than to make every plushie look very little like the original Pokemon it was intended to? These are the Ditto plushies, which would change the Pokemon to have the face of a Ditto. I suppose it's appealing to some, but the large population out there thought they just looked weird. And speaking of looking weird, let's look at Pokemon Lego, or rather the knockoff version of Lego Ionic. When Pokemon created official Ionix Pokemon toys, which just looked wrong. Why is Ash Ketchum built like a Roblox character? We haven't even scratched the surface of the products today, and let's get back into the next with a plush version of a Slowpoke tail. I'm not joking. You could buy this rare valuable material from the Pokemon games. I really don't want to ever meet the Slowpoke that lost these tails, but I do hope they got to see a doctor, as this next product would have certainly helped them. The Pokemon X-ray machines. While yes, not a commercial product, these X-ray machines were designed to help keep kids calm in seeing familiar faces from Pokemon. However, personally, I would not want to see a Pikachu while I am getting blasted with radiation. Pokemon have had some incredibly bizarre crossovers in their history, and none more so than their collaboration with Heinz to create Pokemon-shaped spaghetti hoops. I would rather not eat Pokemon, although the Pokemon Company has certainly leaned into this with the new games. Speaking of eating Pokemon, another weird product the Pokemon Company has made before is the Pokemon branded Kiki Narui. Sorry if I butchered that. When you look at the box, it appears you are eating a rather green Pikachu. I certainly would never want to eat this, but to each their own. In at number 13, we have the official Pokemon cars. Yes, cars, plural. Since 1998, Pokemon has had numerous collaborations with car companies to create the best Pokemon-themed vehicles they can. Their most recent being a collaboration with BMW to create an entirely electric Pikachu car, which was revealed at Gamescom in 2022. While yes, just a concept car, I certainly hope we will see these on the road sometime soon. Next up, we have the Pokemon Pumpkins, which are created for Halloween. They were clever, but still a weird decision from the Pokemon Company. Intending to hold their brand new trick-or-trade cards, the Pokemon Pumpkins certainly were not scary to look at, but might make me think twice about knocking on that person's door. Speaking of scary, let's talk about the sleeping Pokemon plushies, and more importantly, this Gengar plushie, which appears to have a Gengar trying to eat you while you sleep. These are a much more Eastern tradition as opposed to the West, and as such, they are quite hard to come by in the West, making them a bit rarer. Continuing with the theme of scary, let's talk about this Japanese exclusive Drifloon plushie, which seems to depict a Drifloon hot air balloon. Given the weird connotations Drifloon has to, you know, kidnapping children, I certainly would not buy this for any of my kids for fear of them being whisked away. Next at number 9, we have the Pokemon kitchen utensils. I know I spoke about this in my 20 rare Pokemon products you may own video, however, this is still a bizarre thing Pokemon have actually made, and they made quite a lot of these in the past. I'm not entirely sure why they made some of these items, since I don't really want to be pouring salt and pepper out of a hole in Pikachu's head. And at number 8, let's talk about probably the worst idea the Pokemon Company ever had for licensed merchandise. The Pikachu ears and tail dress-up kit. Yes, this was a real thing. Why Nintendo thought making something like this was a good idea is completely beyond me. However, I may just be ruined by the internet. Let's talk about the most cursed Pokemon plushie they ever made. The play-by-play Mew plushie from 1999. Why does it look like that? As I'm sure you can tell, we at the Pokeplanet are huge Mew fans, but this is just terrifying. Yeah, I'm gonna have to buy this one. Moving away from cursed merchandise, let's come back to a very weird choice Pokemon made that actually was dangerous to consumers. And as I'm sure you are all more than aware, we have the Burger King Pokemon containers that had to be recalled because they were a suffocation hazard. These Pokeballs were only 3 inches in diameter, making them very easy for children to put on their face. And since they connected together, one child unfortunately passed away after suffocating on this toy. Seriously, Pokemon, what were you thinking? Moving away from such an upsetting topic, let's talk about the Squirtle drinking cup. As a Squirtle fan, this traumatizes me a little bit because am I drinking the liquid inside Squirtle, or is he producing water through his head? Either way, this is terrifying. Before we get into our top 3, let's talk about the talking Ash Ketchum figurine. Released in the late 90s, this toy depicted Ash Ketchum and would talk and say voice lines.
Hey, I'm Ash. I train Pokemon. I train Pikachu. Should we have a battle? See ya.
Personally, I would hate to see what would have happened if this toy malfunctioned. Finally, our top 3, and let's start with the Pokemon energy drinks. Yes, this is actually a thing. There is nothing wrong with making energy drinks for Pokemon, but my biggest qualm with them is they taste awful. Who would actually take the time to drink these? Before we hit our final 2, I would like to ask you guys to check you're subscribed, as it really helps me out. Anyway, at number 2, we have the Pikachu Loves Ketchup figurines. Why? Why did they turn these into a promotional line of figurines? I mean, I guess they're kind of cute, but who would actually actually buy these. And finally, we have got the Pokemon diapers. Yes, these are real, and yes, they are officially licensed. But why? Why would I worry about putting a baby in Pokemon-themed diapers? That is just bizarre.
See ya.
Pokemon Unite has been around for quite a while now, and we have received some really amazing Pokemon into the game, besides you, Mr. Mime. But what are some of the Pokemon I personally would want to see in Pokemon Unite? Well, let's start this list, and in no particular order, let's begin with Genesect. When I was studying the Pokemon Unite roster, one thing that sticks out immensely is the distinct lack of Pokemon from Generation 5. So when I was trying to decide who would fit in best from this region, I settled on Genesect. With the ability to change the drive attached to Genesect, every different Pokemon that Genesect defeats would change his typing, and therefore the effect of his Techno Blast move. His Techno Blast would be a second stage move tied in with something like Iron Head or Metal Burst. As for his initial move pool, I can see a Bug-type Pokemon move similar to Buzzwole's Fell Stinger. I can see Genesect fitting in a similar way to Greninja, with a mix of ranged and close-up moves. For this same reason, I think Genesect would be an all-round melee, with a mix of the ranged Techno Blast attack and then the close-up Metal Claw or Iron Head moves. As for his Unite move, I would suggest he uses the Techno Blast to unleash one large beam that can be moved similarly to Decidueye's Unite ability. Mewtwo. Next up, we have Mewtwo, which is a bit more of a challenging Pokemon to implement. Mewtwo would need to be a powerhouse range attacker, able to use moves like Shadow Ball and Psychic when it becomes fully leveled up. His precursor move pool would most likely be Aura Sphere and something like Iron Tail, although I worry these moves would be too powerful for an initial move pool. The reason Mewtwo would be a difficult Pokemon to implement is for this exact reason, as its move pool is naturally very powerful, and I can see Mewtwo working mainly as a ranged attacker. As for Mewtwo's Unite move, the obvious choice would be Mega Evolving into Mega Mewtwo Y, and then unleashing one large Shadow Ball that sucks enemies in. Kangaskhan. Kangaskhan again could be a very interesting Generation 1 addition. The reason I put Kangaskhan in this list over someone like Arcanine is because I feel like Kangaskhan's design makes for much more interesting designs. For Kangaskhan's initial move pool, I would most likely suggest Headbutt and Double Hit. The reason behind this would be Headbutt would have Kangaskhan attack from a bit further away, and then Double Hit requires you to be up close and personal. For his second tier moveset, I would suggest Iron Head as an increased power version of Headbutt, and then Giga Impact with the drawback of 3 seconds of stun. I would like to see a Unite move that incorporates the baby Kangaskhan without the need to Mega Evolve. Something like giving Kangaskhan 5 seconds where it can attack twice with every hit it unleashes, dealing double damage for a short time. As for his role, I can see Kangaskhan as a melee defender. Cryogonal. Now, when I was trying to think of a powerful support Pokemon that could still pump out some damage, it was tough to choose. I knew I wanted to put forward another Gen 5 Pokemon, but I thought about using other Pokemon before settling on Cryogonal. The reason I picked Cryogonal is largely because Pokemon Unite has shown they aren't afraid to put in weird Pokemon as champions, such as Cramorant. Now, Cryogonal could be any particular role, but I'd want to see him as a ranged supporter, similar to someone like Eldegoss, with some of the same aspects as Mr. Mime and his defensive nature. For Cryogonal's initial move pool, I would imagine him having Ice Shard and Rapid Spin, where Rapid Spin pushes Cryogonal forward. As for his second move pool, he definitely needs Ice Beam and perhaps Powder Snow to slow down other enemies, which gives him that supporting aspect that Mr. Mime has, which doesn't necessarily buff or help the team, but debuffs the other team. As for Cryogonal's Unite move, I would suggest he starts spinning and bouncing off walls and obstacles while hitting every enemy in his path. Metagross. Generation 3 also has a distinct lack of Pokemon in Pokemon Unite, so of course one of my Hoenn choices had to be Metagross, who, honestly, I'm surprised isn't already in the game. Metagross appears in certain promotional or in-game tutorials throughout Pokemon Unite, but it still isn't a playable character. That's just bizarre. For Metagross's move pool, I would definitely say he needs to start with Headbutt, yes, again, Headbutt, and Confusion, both being up close and personal moves. Then for the final move pool, obviously one of them needs to be Meteor Mash, and then the other I would suggest as Metal Claw. Metagross will definitely be an up close and personal fighter, meaning I would say he's a melee all-rounder Pokemon, with a Unite move to complement this, where Metagross would lift up his arms and fire himself forward like a missile, similar to how he looks in his Mega Evolution. Plusle and Minun. From one iconic Generation 3 Pokemon to two, let's talk about Plusle and Minun, who I honestly think could have one of the most interesting battle mechanics yet. Two Pokemon that battle at the same time. I can see the Plusle and Minun champions working similarly to the Ice Climbers in Smash Bros, with both of them working simultaneously. I would see Plusle and Minun starting with Thundershock and Tackle, where they are able to use both one after the other, which in the case of Tackle would propel them forward. As for their secondary moves, I would want them to get Discharge and Thunder Wave, and with Thunder Wave as a secondary move, we have of course got to make Plusle and Minun a support attacker. For their Unite move, I would like to see them both summon a lightning bolt that travels around them in a circle, dealing massive damage. Crocodile. Crocodile is one of my favorite Pokemon, so of course I had to put Crocodile on this list as potentially one of the most interesting melee speedsters I can think of. I would imagine Crocodile as a melee speedster with an immense amount of movement, able to use moves like Dig and Bulldoze. I would imagine Sandile starting with something like Mud Slap and Tackle, and then getting access to Dig upon evolution. As for Crocodile's Unite move, I'm imagining an Earthquake move that damages and slows enemies, making easy pickings for teammates. Crocodile would certainly not be surprising if it were to join the roster. The next two Pokemon I have put into the list together, since I feel like they do go hand in hand. Electivire and Magmortar. Electivire and Magmortar will most definitely be in Pokemon Unite one day, and I imagine they will both be attackers. I'll start with Electivire, who I think would be a melee attacker, using moves like Thunder Punch and Ice Punch upon evolution, but beginning with moves like Tackle and maybe Mach Punch. Electivire's Unite move would be similar to Discharge, where he releases a large wave of electricity that paralyzes enemies and deals damage. Now let's move on to Magmortar, who I believe would be a ranged attacker, using moves like Fire Blast and Flamethrower upon evolution, but beginning with Ember and Flame Burst. Magmortar's Unite move would be similar to, as previously mentioned, Decidueye's, where he unleashes a large constant flame, burning enemies like Cinderace's passive ability. Excadrill. Now let's talk about another iconic Pokemon from Generation 5, and let's talk about Excadrill. Currently one of the most sought after Pokemon in Pokemon Go, I would like to see Excadrill come into Pokemon Unite as an equally powerful attacker. I can see Drillbur beginning with Mud Slap and Tackle, and then Excadrill getting access to Bulldoze and Drill Run. I'd imagine Excadrill in a similar way to Crocodile, with a move pool that lets him jump in to deal damage, but then able to get away quickly, similar to Gengar's Hex ability. As for his Unite move, let's have Excadrill turn into a giant drill and jump above the enemies before stunning them by pushing them into the ground beneath them. I would like to see Excadrill as a melee all-rounder and perhaps another good jungle Pokemon. For Alligator, let's talk about a starter Pokemon. Pokemon Unite has done a surprisingly bad job of implementing the starter Pokemon into the game, with us only recently getting Inteleon added and still waiting on Rillaboom despite Cinderace being in the game since release. We have currently no Pokemon from Generation 2's starters, so where better to begin than for Alligator, another melee all-rounder who could jump in to deal damage with moves like Dive and Crunch upon evolution, but beginning with Bite and Aqua Jet. As for his Unite move, let's give for Alligator the ability to create a whirlpool that deals damage and pushes enemies away from the area of effect. I could see for Alligator as another melee all-rounder, maybe even a melee speedster. Annihilate. Generation 9 has seen some amazing new Pokemon added to the game, and one of my personal favorites is Annihilate. Starting as a Mankey and then working its way up, I imagine Mankey initially would have Low Kick and Tackle before getting access to moves like Close Combat and Rage Fist, with Rage Fist dealing more damage when Annihilate is low. As for his Unite move, let's give Annihilate Focus Punch, sending out a giant fist that travels forever, hitting any Pokemon in the way. Annihilate would be a surprising but interesting addition to the game, especially with the introduction of Generation 9 coming into Pokemon Unite. Only time will tell. Togekiss. Let's bring another ranged attacker in the mix, and let's talk about Togekiss. Togekiss could be an interesting addition to Pokemon Unite, being a ranged attacker. I would probably start Togepi off with Ancient Power and Pound. However, if Pokemon Unite decide to start it off as a Togetic, I would give it Ancient Power and Fairy Wind. When Togekiss evolved, I would give it Aura Sphere and Dazzling Gleam to be used as ranged attacks. For its Unite move, I would want to see something to the same effect of Max Starfall, where a giant star would drop from the sky, dealing massive damage. Oricorio. Oricorio would be another interesting choice to add to the game. Oricorio is well known for its ability to change its typing based on where it is found in Alola. But what if it were done based off the moves Oricorio selected? Well, that's where my idea for Oricorio begins. At the beginning of the game, you would start as any of the Oricorio, but upon selecting either Ember, Thundershock, Psybeam, or Ominous Wind, the Pokemon's appearance and available move pool would change, with the second stage of the moves being Flamethrower, Thunderbolt, Psyshock, and Nightshade. For Oricorio's second move, I would begin with Wing Attack and then move on to Revelation Dance, which can act as a buff on other players, giving them temporary increased scoring speed, making Oricorio a supporter character. Oricorio has the potential to be a very interesting choice for this game, but would be a bit challenging to implement in the way I'm seeing it. Zamazenta. Recently we saw Zacian come to Pokemon Unite as a melee all-rounder, but where is Zacian's counterpart Zamazenta? Well, my idea for Zamazenta is very similar to Zacian. Also a melee all-rounder, Zamazenta would be much tankier than Zacian, with the drawback of dealing less damage, making it much more defensive than offensive, beginning with Iron Defense and Slash, and then evolving to get Behemoth Bash and Iron Head, making it a tanky up-close and personal attacker, which could be incredibly versatile for preventing opponents from scoring. As for its Unite move, I would suggest a continuous push forward lasting 3 seconds, dealing damage as the Pokemon are pushed away, and then dealing bonus damage if they hit a wall or obstacle, or even another Pokemon. Spiritomb. Now, let's talk about the most annoying Pokemon ever released in any Pokemon game. Spiritomb. Spiritomb could be interesting regardless of how annoying it is to find in mainline games. Pokemon Legends Arceus introduced a new method of finding Spiritomb that I think could be incorporated into Pokemon Unite, the Wisps. I imagine as Spiritomb defeats Pokemon, it becomes more powerful up to a certain point, meaning it does more damage with the more souls it collects. For its initial move pool, I would start Spiritomb with Shadow Sneak and Nightshade before leveling up and getting access to Hex and Dark Pulse. As for its Unite move, I would like to see Spiritomb become larger and release a large pulse of energy that deals large amounts of damage against enemies. For this move pool, I would expect Spiritomb to be a melee champion. Shadow Rider / Ice Rider Calyrex. Now, for what could be a very cool split evolution, we have Calyrex. Now, Calyrex would begin begin as the base form Calyrex, before reaching level 8 and getting to choose between either Shadow Rider and Ice Rider Calyrex, where he becomes faster when traveling. For Carylex's move pool, I would begin with Mega Drain and Pound, before getting access to Giga Drain and either Shadow Ball for Shadow Rider Calyrex or Avalanche for Ice Rider Calyrex. Calyrex's Unite move would have to be either Astral Barrage or Glacial Lance, based on which rider you picked. I would see Calyrex as another up close and personal attacker, being another melee all-rounder. Chestnut. Before we get into my final pick, I just want to mention Chestnut as another Pokemon that should be in the game. Chestnut would most likely be a melee attacker, beginning with Razor Leaf and Pound, before evolving and getting moves like Pin Missile and Spiky Shield, with the latter dealing damage to an opponent whenever Chestnut is attacked. Chestnut's Unite move I would like to see similarly to Blastoise, where he turns into a shell and begins to spin, dealing damage to any Pokemon that it comes near. Before we get into the last one, here are a couple of honorable mentions. Dragalge, Surfetched, Samurott, Typhlosion, Manectric, and Slurpuff. Noivern. And finally, we have Noivern, another Pokemon that could have some very interesting features. For Noibat's initial moveset, I wanted to complement the ranged/close combat attacker role. I would give this Pokemon access to Dragon Range and Super Thing before leveling up and getting access to moves like Dragon Pulse and Hurricane. Notice I left Boom Burst out, but this is because I can see Boom Burst being Noivern's Unite move, where he releases 3 blasts of Boom Burst, pushing people away and dealing damage. I can imagine Noivern as a ranged attacker. But what do you guys think? And what Pokemon do you want to come to Pokemon Unite? Let me know by joining my Discord and having a conversation.
Pokemon has had thousands of products produced in their 25-year time span, but for all the products we see in the West, there are hundreds, if not thousands more exclusive to Japan. So in this video, we're going to be looking at 20 Pokemon products exclusive to Japan, and we're going to start with one of the weirder exclusive products that we never got access to in the West, and that is Pokemon trainer statues. We have gotten a lot of Pokemon statues in the West, but the Pokemon Company has also made countless collectible figures and plushies for iconic trainers from the games, anime, and manga. Some of the more noticeable products include this plush version of Alistair, this statue figure of Brendan from the Generation 3 games, and my personal favorite set of statues, the Tamaratomi Yummy Sweets figures including Pokemon like Mew, Gumi, and Drifloon. Drifloon, again, on a figure. Don't buy your kids ice cream in Japan, I guess. Up next, we have the world of Pokemon hair accessories, where we have the Pokemon hairbands, which have not as of yet been officially released in the West. Some of the Pokemon they use for these hairbands include Snorlax, Gengar, and Ditto. While on the topic of clothing, let's also throw in this set of drawstring bags that can't be that hard to produce for the States, featuring Pokemon like Raikou and Rayquaza. It's such a cool product that I wish we had over here in the West. Pokemon cards have become a huge part of the Pokemon TCG, and we're going to talk about some of the rare Pokemon cards in a bit, I promise. But for now, let's talk about the countless Pokemon sleeves that are exclusive to Japan. These card sleeves are pretty cheap to make, and I'd imagine the profit margin for these products is immensely high, so why not make them for the West? It's truly a shame, as some of these exclusive card sleeves are really awesome, and if there isn't a Pokemon you like in the Western release of card sleeves, just check these ones out, as I can guarantee it has been released in Japan. In recent episodes, we have spoken about Pokemon kitchenware, and this had us looking into some of the rarer products out there. While we were looking, we found a plethora of Japanese exclusive kitchenware, but to keep this video under 10 hours long, we have found one of these lines of kitchenware that I personally believe are some of the coolest designs I've ever seen. These are the Hanten Mamizara plates, which are exclusive to the East. And just look at how adorable they are, even incorporating Pokemon you would never expect, including Mienfoo, the one fighting type no one ever remembers. I understand this kitchenware is very niche and probably would not sell very well in the West, but right now I want the entire set. Before we move into the top 10, I found a product that does not make much sense to me, but I want to get your opinion on. The Bandai Kunut series of figures. They somewhat resemble football training dummies, but in a Pokemon fashion. From what I was able to gather, using my absolutely no knowledge of Japanese, there are about 7 series of this figure style ever released, but it has gone largely unheard of in the West. But what do you think? Are they weird or kinda cute? Next up, we have the Pokemon Mystery Dungeon games exclusive to Japan. The Wii was a massively popular console, and obviously around this time, the DS and Game Boys were still really popular. In the West, we got access to countless Pokemon Mystery Dungeon games, such as Mystery Dungeon Blue Rescue Team, Mystery Dungeon Red Rescue Team, and Mystery Dungeon Explorers of Time, but I bet you did not know that Japan had 3 exclusive titles that we never got to see in the West. These games include Mystery Dungeon Keep Going Blazing Adventure Squad, Mystery Dungeon Let's Go Stormy Adventure Squad, and Mystery Dungeon Go For It Light Adventure Squad. Why we never got these games in the West is a bit baffling. It certainly makes these games a bit more elusive. While we are on the topic of Pokemon games, let's talk about the Pokemon games for the Sega Pico. You heard me right. Pokemon games released on a Sega console. Well, the Sega Pico was one of the last consoles that Sega ever really made and was intended for much younger audiences. The cartridges used for this console were essentially books, similar to a lot of other consoles aimed at children. The Pokemon games we saw on this console included Pokemon Catch the Numbers, Pokemon Advanced Generations, I've Begun Hiragana and Katakana, Pokemon Advanced Generations, Pico for Everyone, Pokemon Loud Battle. While yes, we saw the Sega Pico outside of Japan, these games never really saw the light of day in the West and have such become massively sought out by collectors throughout the West. Moving away from games for a moment, let's just talk about a couple of the Pokemon cards that were never released in the West. Pokemon TCG has a pretty decent system for releasing cards in Japan and then the West. It is very fluid and well designed. When you look at the most recent Paldea Evolved set, it is the combination of 3 Japanese sets which include Snow Hazard, Clayburst, and Triple Beat. However, this has not always been the case. I found 3 TCG cards that we never saw released in the West. These cards are Pikachu, Jigglypuff, and Clefairy, Mischievous Pichu, and Great Rocket's Mewtwo. These 3 cards were never released in the West largely because they came from different promotions that were ongoing in Japan. The Pikachu, Jigglypuff, Clefairy card was included in the July 1997 CoroCoro magazine as a jumbo promotional card and tie-in with the Magical Pokemon Journeys manga, since these 3 Pokemon were befriended by the protagonist Hazel. The Mischievous Pichu card was released as a partnership product between the Pokemon Company, a fashion brand called Granif, and Hajime Sayasho, a Japanese content creator. The card did have some English version float through the internet a while ago, but the card was never officially released in the West. Great Rocket's Mewtwo was another interesting card because it was released alongside a sequel to the TCG game for the Game Boy, despite us never seeing that sequel. The game the card comes from was titled Pokemon Card GB2 Here Comes Team GR. We will likely never see an English release for these cards due to most of them being over 20 years old, but the value of these cards nowadays is extraordinary. Now on this channel, we love talking about plushies, and Pokemon plushies are now a main part of the Pokemon merchandising lines, but there are hundreds of plushies out there that have never been released in the West. Let's talk about some of my personal favorites. Poncho Pikachus are some of the most sought after collectible plushies that you can get from Japan. These Pikachu plushies come in a unique outfit of a Mega Pokemon. These include Mega Rayquaza, Mega Charizard, and Mega Sableye, which is one of the rarer ones to find. Shiny Mega Gardevoir is a very weird Pokemon to create a plushie for, since it never had any lore relevance in the anime or the video games, at least in the same way as Steven's Metagross, but the plushie is still very cool. It's very difficult to list more of these since there are just so many of them, but if any of you have any Japanese exclusive Pokemon plushies, I'd love to see them, so join the Discord and share some of your weird exclusive plushies. While researching for this video, we looked everywhere to find some of the weirder products that are exclusive to Japan, and imagine my surprise when I found this Pikachu sponge. Firstly, this is a bizarrely niche product for the Pokemon Company to make, but the real question is why have we not got a Western release of this? Pokemon centers in Japan are much more like department stores where you can get a lot more than just plushies or Pokemon cards. Not only can you get this adorable Pikachu sponge, you can also get things such as pillows, tableware, and clothing. It's truly an amazing place. If any Pokemon fans ever find their way to Japan, definitely go in and have a look. Let's talk about a brand I had never heard of, which I believe is called Moncole or Monster Collection. These toys are created by Takara Tomy and are some of the most well-designed Pokemon toys I have ever seen. Just to list a few that I personally really like: Pawmi, Sprigatito, Eevee. Now the numbers on these photos do actually mean something, as they are as collectible as the TCG cards for people in Japan due to them being incredibly cheap, and this of course leads to a large collector base for these toys, and you can actually get these toys in the West despite them being exclusive to Japan, so definitely have a look when you're done watching this video. We've spoken about video games, we've spoken about weird merch, now let's talk about manga. Manga has slowly become bigger in the West, however in Eastern countries, manga has been one of the main sources of entertainment for years, and Pokemon has been a key part of that since 1996, which is what largely popularized the series in the East. However, despite the growing popularity of manga in the West, there have been countless iterations of the manga that we never got to see an English release, such as the elusive aim to be a card master manga. Think if the Pokemon universe took more of a Yu-Gi-Oh approach, where cards are used to battle each other as opposed to the physical Pokemon, that's what this series was. Well, Series is a bit of a stretch, since this manga only ever had one volume printed, meaning it definitely did not perform well, and that's why we never got to see it in the West. There have, of course, been other manga iterations of the Pokemon universe that were more popular that we never got to see, such as the Pokemon Pocket Monsters manga, which was wildly successful, but we never saw, likely due to some of the more racy humor, which would be censored in all Pokemon media outside of Japan. Pokemon Go revived the Pokemon franchise for a lot of people who had not played the game since the 90s, but this was not Pokemon's first attempt at creating an app to coincide with their massively successful franchise. The Pokemon Company has made a fair few apps in the past for mobile phones, but let's go back to the first ever Pokemon app, which was called Pokemate. The game basically allowed you to catch Pokemon and send messages to people you were friends with in the game. Think Tamagotchi, but for Pokemon. That's basically what this game was. The problem this game faced, however, is that you were limited to 3 Pokemon at a time unless you were willing to pay a monthly subscription. Imagine Pokemon Go, but you had to pay to have more than 3 Pokemon. You'd think all Niantic cared about was money, which is crazy, right? Pokemate was displayed at E3 in 2006 as they had an English release planned, however the game never made it outside of Japan. Next, let's talk about food, and I'm not talking about Slowpoke Tails or Cloth Stick, I'm talking about official Pokemon food licensed by the Pokemon Company. In Japan, candy is a very different style to that in the West, so countless different types of Pokemon candy have been released in Japan that we never saw in the West. Some of my personal favorites include Pokemon Corn Puff Snacks, Pokemon Xylitol Ramune Candy, Fuji Am I a Pokemon Donut Balls, Koala's March Pokemon Cookies, specifically the cheesecake mix, and the Lottie Pokepuni Pokemon Gummy. Candy in Japan is so much better than anywhere else in the world, and thankfully, nowadays, due to easier access to these candies, you can get them in the States relatively easily, so definitely worth ordering. And finally, in at number 1, we have Pokemon Household Utilities. I'm talking about Pokemon Toilet Paper, Pokemon Baby Wipes, Pokemon Diapers, and so much more. These products are massively exclusive to Japan, since the companies in the West do not want to partner up with the Pokemon Company, despite them being one of the most successful franchises of all times. But, and I've said this before, I would feel pretty horrendous if I was using an electric rat every time I went to the bathroom.
When a company has been around as long as the Pokemon Company has been, eventually you're bound to have some controversies. That is why in this video we are going over the 15 biggest controversies in Pokemon. And where better to start than with the Pokemon Jinx, an extremely controversial Pokemon due to the fact it has resemblances to negative stereotypes towards black people. Jinx's design appears to resemble that of the characters from Little Black Sambo, which in itself has been an incredibly controversial book since the mid to late 20th century. The book was first released in 1899, and throughout the near 100 years between the publishing of this book and the creation of Jinx, you would think that the Pokemon Company would have thought a bit more about copying a design from such a controversial book. In at number 14, we have the Electric Soldier Porygon episode of the Pokemon anime. This episode's story has become synonymous with Pokemon controversies, and even today, almost 25 years after the episode aired in Japan, people still talk about it. In Electric Soldier Porygon, Pikachu has to use Thunderbolt to stop a deadly computer virus, and this led to immense flashing lights between red and blue colors. This is what would lead to 10% of viewers experiencing headaches and migraines, while another huge percentage would experience seizures, unconsciousness, and sometimes even temporary blindness. This event led to 685 children throughout Japan being hospitalized.
British television applies regulations to weed out dangerous flicker, typically caused by rapid contrasts, black on white, white on black.
1 child in 200 in this age group of 5 to 20 is what's called photosensitive. That means that if a child is photosensitive, flashing lights at a certain rate, most commonly between 10 and 20 flashes per second, may precipitate an epileptic seizure.
It's actually what potentially led to the name change from Pocket Monsters to Pokemon, since the West had also publicized this news. So to avoid negative press, Pocket Monsters was renamed to Pokemon in the West. Next up, we have the Legend of Dratini episode of the Pokemon anime. The episode was an absolute fever dream to watch when researching for this video. The basic plot is simple. Ash gets challenged by Team Rocket to catch as many Pokemon as possible within the Safari Zone, with Ash catching his 30 Tauros in this episode. Team Rocket manages to get the drop on the Safari Game Warden to give up the location of a Dratini. In the end, they all see the Dratini. But this does not seem that controversial, right? Well, I may have missed out some minor details. For starters, the game leader's name is Kaiser, which for anyone who is not clued in on German politics, the Kaiser is essentially the monarch within Germany, the head of state perhaps being a more fitting term. And at one point in this episode, Kaiser actually points a gun at Ash's head. Allegedly, there is also a reference to Hitler, since during an interrogation scene in the episode, Meowth puts on a fake mustache that multiple sources say is a reference to Hitler. Clearly not the best choice for the Pokemon Company. Interestingly, this is also the first episode that was ever banned internationally, although only 3 episodes later we would get Electric Salt at Porygon. Now let's talk about one other controversy that I have actually spoken about before. The 1999 Burger King Pokemon collaboration, which led to the death of a young child. Back in 1999, toys coming in meals was huge, from the Happy Meal at McDonald's to Burger King's own spin on things. However, when Burger King and Pokemon collaborated together, evidently no one from health and safety looked at this product. The product was a Pokeball that would have a top and bottom half that were connected and could not be separated. This is of course what led to this child's unfortunate passing, as they covered their nose and mouth with the Pokeball and were unable to breathe. This was a PR nightmare for the Pokemon Company, and they even tried to recall all the Pokeballs in exchange for fries. But at this point, the damage was already done, and their reputation was forever tainted by this disastrous campaign. Pokemon cards are back as a main staple of the Pokemon Company, seeing levels of hype close to what they were back in the 90s. However, during the coronavirus pandemic, there was a distinct shortage of Pokemon cards, with people unable to go to a nearby Target and pick up these Pokemon cards. This was because scalpers were coming in and picking up all available stock of Pokemon cards so they could sell them on at a higher price. This led to a lot of aggression and violence when people were shopping for these new Pokemon sets.
Shoppers at a Brookfield Target were forced to run and hide after a fight this morning in the parking lot.
Police say it all started with a disagreement over trading cards. Cassie Williams is live with more on why this may have happened.
Just 20 minutes after sales began this morning, things got physical.
I have a Charizard of this. I just can't find it right now.
8-year-old Mason likes collecting cards, but his mom has trouble finding them.
It's kind of sad that there's a lot of kids that are that enjoy opening the packs and looking at them and seeing what you get. They can't even really do that because you can't find them.
Everyone started running.
I'm like, what happened? What happened? And they're like, we don't know. We don't know.
Hearing something about a fight and a gun, Brookfield police say a 35-year-old man was physically assaulted by 4 other men in the parking lot after an argument over trading cards. The victim pulled out the gun he was legally carrying, and the 4 attackers ran away. Jeff Lemieux at Jeff Sports says the craze all started with the pandemic.
When COVID hit, people were just bored. Didn't have anything to do.
Lemieux has limited how many cards people can buy at his store.
As a result of this, Target temporarily pulled all trading cards from their shelves. Pokemon's answer to this was to reprint some of these sets, and of course this caused a huge drop in the value of these cards, with a lot of them halving almost overnight. One organization that is certainly a thorn in the side of the general public is PETA, or the People for the Ethical Treatment of Animals, a highly controversial group that stands for good treatment of animals and will resolve to incredibly radical and often false doctrines about what is the wrong and what is the right way to treat an animal. But where does this organization fit in with Pokemon? Well, PETA believes that Pokemon promotes animal cruelty, and when Black and White 2 were released, PETA created a parody game called Black and Blue to try and get their point across. Their argument was incredibly ridiculous, as this is what they had to say. The amount of time that Pokemon spend stuffed in Pokeballs is akin to how elephants are chained up in train carts, waiting to be let out to perform in circuses. But the difference between real life and this fictional world full of organized animal fighting is that Pokemon games paint rosy pictures of things that are actually horrible. Yes, because when I look at a Pokemon like Trubbish, my first thought is obviously to go and dropkick a puppy. Years later on from this statement, PETA would declare that all of their offices were Pokemon Cove safe zones, and that no one would be allowed to capture or fight their Pokemon in the building. PETA, seriously? While we're on the topic of people completely misinterpreting Pokemon, let's talk about Satanic Panic. Satanic Panic is not a new thing and has been around for decades, with people calling everything from Dungeons and Dragons to the Smurfs a way of summoning demons. Yeah, I know, the Smurfs did actually have this happen. However, Pokemon's case is a bit more interesting. When Pokemania was at its peak in the West during the late 90s and early 2000s, people were adamant that Pokemon portrayed values that opposed Christianity and therefore were a front for Satanism. We're talking things like Pokemon evolution and the ability to throw Pokeballs and summon Pokemon.
So Pokemon is a game that teaches children how to enter into the world of witchcraft, how to cast spells, how to use psychic phenomena, how to put to work supernatural powers against their enemies, how to fantasy role play. Pokemon world is a world of the demonic.
Do people seriously not understand that video games are not real? There was a quote by a Florida-based pastor by the name of Eugene Walton who claimed this: "You get all these potions and witchcraft, and the idea is to try and control other people." Did Pastor Walton ever even play a Pokemon game, or did he just Google one of the mechanics within the game? Why does he not mention that you can breed Pokemon without marrying them together first? Now that is outrageous. We've not spoken about a banned Pokemon card in a while, so let's look into the story of Uri Geller a bit more. In 1999, a psychic named Uri Geller sues Pokemon for using his likeness to create create the Pokemon we in the West know as Kadabra. In the East, Kadabra's name is Yungara, which isn't that far off of Uri Geller, and also because of Kadabra's spoon, which was a constant act done by Uri Geller whenever he would try and bend spoons. Geller also claimed that the markings on Kadabra's head portrayed Nazism, and therefore he did not want Pokemon to ever use the Pokemon in any promotional material, since he felt they had turned him into an evil occult Pokemon character. Uri Geller sued the Pokemon Company for millions, and so the Pokemon Company decided they would not use Kadabra in any promotional materials, and this lasted for over 20 years. However, in 2020, Uri Geller had a change of heart due to the amount of complaints he had received from Pokemon fans who wanted to see Kadabra come back. Geller apologized for all of the lawsuits, most of which have been dismissed, and lifted the ban on Pokemon's use of Kadabra, so at least this story has a happy ending. Let's talk about the many controversies of Pokemon Go, and more explicitly the location of certain Pokestops. Now, Pokemon Go is going to take up the next 2 spots on the list, since there are 2 things I want to talk about that are both related to Pokemon Go. But first of all, the locations of Pokestops. Pokestops are a fundamental aspect of Pokemon Go, being the way you attain items such as Pokeballs and berries. When Pokemon Go was skyrocketing in popularity after release, people started to question some of the landmarks that Niantic had decided to transform into Pokestops. Most notably, locations such as the Holocaust Memorial Museum, the Pentagon, the Church of Scientology, and literally random civilian houses. Niantic had allowed some of these controversial and bizarre locations to be turned into Pokestops, and countless people complained about people breaking into their back garden or trying to catch Pokemon in the Holocaust Memorial Museum. But boys, we are not done yet with Pokemon Go, as we go into number 6 on this list, which is the current state of Pokemon Go. Pokemon Go's initial popularity has died down, however it is still quite popular. But is Pokemon Go dying? Well, yes. With some of the recent choices Niantic has made, it seems the state of Pokemon Go is immensely fragile. Pokemon Go is currently being slashed by fans with changes such as price increase to remote raid passes. Remote raid passes will allow players to partake in raids from their own home, and were introduced in 2020 at the height of the COVID lockdown rules instated across the world. Remote raiding had just become the norm for Pokemon Go, so when Niantic announced the changes they were making to remote raid passes, people were outraged and threw it back in Niantic's face, practically begging them not to make these changes. However, Niantic would not listen to the community and decided to implement the changes anyway, in an attempt to make more money. Now, this did not work for them, as in May 2023, Pokemon Go had its most unsuccessful month in 5 years, which is insane. Me and my partners still play Pokemon Go occasionally, and we are now at the point of talking about when the game will eventually be canned by Pokemon, and I honestly can't see the game lasting much longer. Pokemon as a franchise now has well over 1,000 creatures to collect, really adding to the gotta catch 'em all tagline, right? Well, no. As we talk about the next controversy that the Pokemon Company had to deal with, Dexit. Well, yes, not the official term in Generation 8's Pokemon game Sword and Shield. In an attempt to try and reduce the amount of 3D models required for the games, Pokemon announced there would be no national Dex in Pokemon, essentially writing hundreds of Pokemon out of the game, and people were not happy. This was right around the time that Pokemon Home was being released, and as such, people were excited to bring their Pokemon into the Nintendo Switch for another brand new adventure. But now countless Pokemon could not be brought into Sword and Shield, and people were outraged. Dexit began trending on Twitter, which is kind of funny given this was the same time as Brexit in the United Kingdom, and of course Gallo was set in the UK. So to the fan that began this trend and hashtag, well done. Before we get into the top 3, let's talk about another incredibly stupid controversy that some people genuinely seem to care about. The Pokemon Game Corner was a staple within the older Pokemon games, and were basically a fate slot machine / gambling simulation where players could win exclusive Pokemon like Dratini and Porygon. Now, this was before the time where people had genuine concern over gambling addiction and how bad it truly is. But the argument put forth by the boards who control things like age ratings for games is that any game that shows gambling needs to be rated according to that. In the UK, the grading system is called PEGI, who rate all video games, and they told the Pokemon Company that if they include the Game Corner in their games, the Pokemon games would be rated 18+. Seriously. Imagine an 18+ or R-rated Pokemon game. I genuinely could not imagine Pikachu carrying around an AR, shouting swear words, drinking alcohol, and gambling. Finally, the top 3. If you guys have watched this far, come on, subscribe. I'm not asking again. Right, let's keep going. Let's go back to Pokemon Go quickly and talk about some of the controversies that can be attributed to Pokemon Go, but not directly Pokemon's fault. When Pokemon Go was at its highest usage, criminal organizations had figured out they could use Pokemon Go hotspots to target individuals who would have things like cell phones, cameras, power banks, wallets, and more. Individuals would hang around these locations late at night and wait for people to come by to get the Pokestop or gym. Just watch this to understand more.
He's just a lazy Pokemon player. Take it off. No, please. Take it off.
It took this man 2 minutes and 40 seconds to realize what was going on when he swiftly factory reset the phone. But hopefully the live stream was enough to show the police, and thank God Ricky was not more seriously injured during this. This was unfortunately very common for Pokemon Go, and they would put out multiple warnings to fans to be aware of their surroundings when playing the game. Now let's talk about the Pokemon anime for this second spot as we discuss the removal of Brock from the Pokemon anime. Back during Kanto and Johto, the trio of Ash, Mystery, and Brock were untoppable. They were truly the best trio I would argue Pokemon ever had. However, the Pokemon Company made an incredibly bizarre bizarre decision to remove Brock after the Kanto series and replace him with Tracy Sketcher. This was done because the Pokemon Company were worried that Brock was a racial stereotype and therefore could be censored in the West. But people didn't care. They did not think about that kind of stuff given how likable and engaging of a character Brock was, and when they got rid of him for Tracy, it just made the absence of Brock so much more noticeable since Tracy was not very well received. Pokemon censored themselves before the West or 4Kids could do it for them. Pokemon's final controversy that we will discuss today is the Saudi Arabia banning of Pokemon. But to talk about this, we need to explain some more in-depth aspects. Pokemon has the habit of angering a lot of different religions, partially due to the way it portrays things like evolution and I guess witchcraft with potions and whatnot. However, sometimes the lengths these different religions go to try and shun Pokemon is a bit ridiculous. So let's talk about the other two Abrahamic religions. Firstly, let's talk about Judaism and talk about the two biggest aspects that offended the Jewish community. One goldback card I have actually spoken about before seems to depict a swastika on the card, and of course, the Jewish community were not happy with this. However, it was most likely the Japanese community trying to reclaim a symbol that had been tarnished by time. The manji, as it's called, is a symbol of good luck, and it was around for centuries before the Nazis took it for their own selfish methodology. However, another aspect of Pokemon that concerned the Jewish community was, again, Kadabra, believing that the squiggly lines on its stomach were the representative of the symbol of the SS, which is a bit more of a stretch than the manji on the goldback card. Now, the Jewish community may have made one leap, but that is nothing compared to Saudi Arabia, who made the choice to ban Pokemon entirely for three main reasons. First of all, they believed that Pokemon meant I am Jewish, which, disclaimer, it definitely does not. They then also felt that the game was filled with Stars of David. Again, it's definitely not. And then that it promoted gambling, which is a violation of Islamic law, which is a bit more true. The rest of the claims made by Islamic fundamentalists was that the game promoted Darwin's theory of evolution or even Freemasonry beliefs. But how does this differ to the reaction of the Christian community? Well, the Vatican decided the only sin from Pokemon was that it was a weird game, whereas Saudi Arabia decided to ban it entirely. It even passed a fatwa or a religious law to cement this. However, it did not last since Pokemon still found its way to infiltrate Saudi Arabia, and the fatwa was largely forgotten with time. These were the 15 biggest controversies in Pokemon. Let me know what you guys think of these by joining my Discord down below.